Happy 4th of July. I'll start by giving context and setting up the background of who was in the area before Pennsylvania was a colony. First up, there's the Lenape tribe, who lived around the area of New Jersey and East PA at the time Europeans first came here. The oldest history of the area that we know comes from the oral history of the Lenape. According to that, the tribe originally came from somewhere west of the Mississippi River. We don't know why. When they came, they encountered a tribe called the Allegheny. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. They talked to the leaders of the Allegheny and asked if they could settle around the same area. The Allegheny said, I don't want it to get too crowded around here. We'll let you pass through and go further east, though. So the Lenape did that. Or they tried to, and when they started moving, the Allegheny saw that there were a lot more Lenape than they thought there were. So they got nervous the Lenape would get greedy, and they attacked the traveling group of people. This started with a years-long war with thousands dead, and ended with the Allegheny getting chased away south. The Lenape never heard from them again. From the word Allegheny, we get the name of the Allegheny River, and apparently also the names of a few mountains and hills in PA. I don't know the names of mountains or hills in my area. There's also the 5 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. They were mostly in New York, but they also occupied parts of north-central PA. The rest of central PA was occupied by the Susquehannock tribe, who replaced a different tribe that used to live in the same area sometime around 1575, probably, we think. And there was also the Erie tribe way out northwest. We don't know much about that tribe at all. I'll get to the reason why in a little bit. When Europeans first came, they found a group of people who had a good system of agriculture, a complex political and social structure, stone tools, fire, an abundance of food, and not much in the way of technology or what the Europeans called civilization. They found these people, few in number, probably only around 2,000 in the local area, living in a place that was very much an unbroken forest. Miles and miles of nothing but trees, rivers, streams, verdant and abundant with wildlife. During early years of settlement, the Lenape and other tribes related to the Lenape helped the Europeans more than once by giving them food when otherwise they would have starved to death. In the early 1600s, not many Europeans were in the area yet. The closest settlement to the north was the Dutch in what would later become New York, and the closest settlement to the south was the famous Jamestown colony. The first time a European interacted with a native of PA was actually John Smith of the Jamestown colony. Yes, the one from the Pocahontas movie. He came north to the Chesapeake Bay area to explore, so not in Pennsylvania yet. While he was there, the Susquehannock tribe sent people to meet him because they wanted to meet one of these white men that everyone was talking about. Shortly after his visit, there was Henry Hudson, the guy the Hudson Bay was named after. He didn't enter PA either, he was north of the Great Lakes even, but his exploration further inland in the continent inspired people at the Dutch East India Company to do some more exploring. Some of that exploring led them to what is now Delaware, and further up the river into PA. Some of these explorers were Cornelius Hendrickson in 1614, and David Peterson de Vries in 1631. As one might imply from the word company being present in the name Dutch East India Company, they were looking for something they could turn a profit on. In this case, that something was furs. On the Delaware, they built a wood fort called Fort Nassau in 1614. This was actually before New Amsterdam. This fort, sometimes left empty because they didn't always need people to be in there, was where they did business with the natives and traded for furs. One time in 1635, a group of people from Jamestown went up and captured the fort while it was empty. The Dutch laughed a hearty chortle, and they sent an armed warship down there to take it back and put those people on trial in Manhattan. They were later sent back to Jamestown. The Swedish monarchy in 1637 sent a group of people to start a colony on the Delaware, very near the place where Philadelphia is now. They did that, named the place Christina after their queen, traded with locals for furs and tobacco, started a farming community, built a Lutheran church, waited on supply ships from Sweden that took too long to come, appointed a 400-pound man as governor, and in general had a nice time of it, except for some disease in there. By 1647, they had 183 people, and by 1655, there are about 200 of them. The settlement lasts until 1655, in its current form at least. 1655 was when the Dutch at Manhattan said, "Look guys, I know our mother governments are supposed to be friendly, but we were down there first, and you've been annoying our little brothers over at Fort Nassau. So unless you can fight off 300 soldiers plus cannons and warships that we're sending down, we're just gonna take this land back. Toodles." As it happened, the 200 I mentioned included women and children. Basically, the folks at Christina had no hope of fighting off 300 soldiers. They surrendered, and the Dutch took over, and the people there had to swear loyalty to the Dutch within a year and a half, or else just leave. And where else were they going to go? Maryland to live with the English? They swore loyalty and stayed. Back to the tribes for a moment. Remember them selling furs and food to the Europeans? Ever wonder what they were getting back for that? Well, cloth and cooking utensils, pots and pans for a start, metal tools manufactured in Europe that the Native Americans hadn't seen yet. Among the more troublesome things they bought were guns and alcohol. First up, alcohol. Native Americans hadn't seen it before Europeans came. They loved it. A little too much. The tribal leaders noticed that everyone was becoming drunk all the time, and they said to the Dutch, "Hey, our people are drunk all the time. Would you mind not selling them the firewater anymore? Please and thanks." The Dutch thought this over and decided, yeah, these drunk Indians in our camp are getting a little annoying, doing all the bothersome things that excessively drunk people usually do in public, and started fining people if they caught them selling the Indians rum. This didn't stop it altogether, though, because sometimes people just needed to sell alcohol if they wanted to have enough food. As for guns, the whites were pretty interested in not letting the Indians have them, because the Dutch had a habit of stressful relations with local tribes wherever they went in the New World. Lots of effort was made to keep guns away from Indians on the Delaware, but apparently not in New York. It was New Amsterdam at the time. The Iroquois Confederacy ended up getting their hands on a bunch of them, enough of them in fact that they were able to pay a visit to their old rivals, the Erie tribe, and gently remove their language and culture from existence. Yeah, that happened sometime around 1650, and Iroquois with guns made the Lenape to the south and the Mohicans to the north a little nervous. Over to Britain for a second. There's a civil war going on. This country will remain in a state of civil war until 1659. Back to the Delaware River settlement, now under control of the Dutch. The first record we have of a schoolmaster appears in 1657. Around the same time, cows start to be more prevalent. This is a pretty significant change because cows aren't native to North America. They had to be either packed away on a boat from Europe for 2 months, or bred from cows who were packed away on a boat from Europe for 2 months. Also, up in New York, the Dutch have been making bricks, so they could build buildings out of bricks, which are more sturdy and last longer than the material they were using before, mainly wood. The Delaware settlement got some of these bricks. As is characteristic of Dutch colonies in the New World, the Native Americans were not completely content. It started with someone accidentally getting killed by Indians for some stupid reason. Then the Europeans decided they needed to kill 1 or 2 Indians to teach them a lesson. Then the Indians decided they needed to kill 1 or 2 Europeans to teach them a lesson, and this went on and on for a few years. They still traded, though. Gotta have those furs. Enter Cecilius Calvert, the 2nd Baron of Baltimore, who governed Maryland from 1632 to 1675. He wants land. He contacts the Dutch on the Delaware and says, "Hey, this is really no biggie, but we had explorers going through that land you took from the Swedish before you even knew it was there, so if you could just give us our land that we have a claim to, that would be Gucci." The Dutch are like, "Dude, were you even using this land? Why didn't you take it from the Swedish before we did? You say you have a claim to this land because one of your explorers was here 40 years ago, but I haven't seen you touch it since. We conquered it fair and square, so no, we're not handing it over." Calvert then stormed back to his own colony, slightly disgruntled, and did nothing. Somewhere off to the west, the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks are now at war. It looks like a stalemate. Hey look! The year is 1664. England figured itself out. As a consequence, they're ready to start wrestling for control of world trade again. So it's time for the Second Anglo-Dutch War. Creative name for that one. The war didn't actually start until 1665, but that didn't stop James, Duke of York, from gently claiming Manhattan and Delaware from the Dutch, much the same way the Dutch claimed Delaware from the Swedes about a decade or so earlier. Funny how that happens. In 1665, the Duke of York establishes a set of laws known as the Duke's Laws for New York, and by extension the Delaware colony, which protect freedom of religion and guarantee trial by jury. Far away in Europe, William Penn, Jr., the son of a decorated Navy admiral, is fighting for the English in the Second Anglo-Dutch War. After the war, he would live and study away from home and return, much to his followers' displeasure, having converted to a different sect of Christianity, something separate from the Church of England, Quakerism. A few years before the English took over, Parliament passed a law called the Navigation Act. This stated that colonies of England were not allowed to trade with anyone who was not from land controlled by the English. This particular rule didn't matter much to the Dutch and Swedes, who were living under the English flag, since the colony wasn't big enough yet to generate that much trade volume, especially not anything of a quantity that a ship not from the mother country would think twice about. The living under the English flag part must have bothered them, though, because some of the Swedes tried to stage an uprising in 1669. That didn't go well for them. By 1676, the Delaware colony has a court system. By 1677, lots of people came into the New World from England. Most of them settled east of the Delaware River, in New Jersey. But some of them came west. By 1678, there were almost 500 Europeans living west of the Delaware. From this point on, Quakers, a minority Christian group in England, will start coming to the New World, the Delaware colony in particular, because they want to get away from those hard-head Church of England people who never want to treat them with equal rights. The war between the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks is getting pretty messy. They've been fighting on and off for the past few decades, and usually nothing significant happens aside from killing each other's warriors. The Iroquois are winning this ongoing one, though. The colonists are worried about this affecting trade, so they organize a meeting in 1677 between the leaders of the two tribes, and they work out a peace agreement. The year is 1680. Remember that Penn guy who was in the English Navy? Well, his father, the admiral, is now dead. But before he died, he had a pretty impressive military service record, and he had lost part of his personal fortune in Ireland during the war. His son, the younger William Penn, took the opportunity and applied for a land grant in the New World as repayment to his late father's estate. Something west of the Delaware River and north of Maryland, as far north as plantable and as far west as the king is willing to give him. The grant was approved, kinda. The paperwork took almost a year. During the whole huge bureaucratic process, people who were not Penn and were not the king ended up naming the place. I imagine that conversation went something like this. A room full of people. They all look bored. A boardroom, if you will. One of them poses the question. What are we going to name this colony? A moment of silence. The first brave soul gives an answer. Well, the place is full of woods, right? Isn't the Latin word for wood Sylvania or something like that? Why don't we call it Sylvania? The room responds. They like the idea. The first bureaucrat responds. That's great, let's keep the ball rolling. Does anyone have any other ideas? A second brave soul pipes up. Well, the admiral whose estate we're giving this land to was named Penn, right? What if we call it Pennsylvania? The room responds. They like that idea even more. The first bureaucrat seems pleased, but he notices there's one person who hasn't given a response yet. What about you? Do you have any ideas? He sheepishly responds. What if we call it Delaware? You know, because it's on the Delaware River. Or we could call it New London. No? New Aberdeen? No, wait, what are you doing? Please stop! I joke, but that was their actual thought process in coming up with the name Pennsylvania. Anyway, Penn saw the name, and he wasn't too fond of it. He knew it was for his father and all, but he didn't feel great about the thought of people hundreds of years in the future thinking he named the colony after himself out of vanity. So, in early 1681, he went to talk to the king. The king's response was something along the lines of, "It's taken us 7 months to push all this paperwork through. I'm literally giving you control over an entire colony, and you're worried about the name. Don't push your luck, get your butt over there, and start governing Pennsylvania, Governor Penn." Penn mumbled a "yes, your majesty," and prepared to get his butt over to Pennsylvania and start governing. Penn, nearly 2 years later, finally arrived in the colony. He was 38 years old, and he had a wife and 2 kids now. He had sent a letter to the settlers in 1681, when he first officially got the grant, saying, among other things, "You are now fixed at the mercy of no governor that comes to make his fortune great. You shall be governed by laws of your own making, and live a free and, if you will, sober and industrious people. I shall not usurp the right of any or oppress his person." Now he was finally here. A system of government was set up consisting of an assembly with representatives from each county of the colony acting as a legislative branch, and a governor, Penn, acting as the chief executive. This would be a good government, one that had fair, lenient punishments for criminals, not the brutal punishments for petty theft that you saw in England. In fact, the only crime that should carry the death penalty should be premeditated, cold-blooded murder. The trials would be held publicly too. Above all, anyone who believed that Jesus was the Son of the one true God was free to practice any form of religion they pleased. That was the most important part. Great things would come from this place. 'Tis a good country. With a good conscience, it will do well. Quakers had a lot of reason to leave England and come to the New World, given that they were treated as second-class citizens across the pond. Penn made sure they knew that a religious safe haven was available over here. He also spread the word around the European mainland and attracted another religious sect from the Germanic regions, Mennonites, who were similarly mistreated like the Quakers and Puritans. Those people even set up something called the Frankfurt Company back in Europe, whose goal was to buy land from Penn and move Mennonites onto that land. Mennonites indeed moved into PA. The Mennonites are not to be confused with the Amish, however. Those are 2 different groups that came at 2 different times. Although there were a lot of Swedish and Dutch and German people, There were also a lot of English people, and the other cultures melted in, adopting English more than any other language to use on a daily basis. Penn talked boundaries with the Duke of York, up in New York Colony. He managed to get Newcastle and a 12-mile radius of land surrounding it, and he made sure that his colony got control of the river all the way to Delaware Bay, so they had better control and access to trade from it. He agreed to pay 5 shillings rent for this land to the Duke every year. The first General Assembly meeting happened in 1681, over a year before Penn arrived. They started making some laws. First off, Indians were to get fair treatment under the law. In fact, if anyone wronged an Indian, they would face the same legal penalty as if they had wronged a colonist. As far as land settlement goes, they wanted land to be put to use. If settlers go a certain number of years without planting crops on their land, the government would be allowed to settle a new family on that land who would plant it. They established rules for the assembly to operate by, as well as prerequisites for assembly members. They must be at least 21 years old, must confess belief in Jesus and God, and must own at least 100 acres of land. It was agreed on that people who derided others on the basis of religion should be looked on as disturbers of the peace, that taking the Lord's name in vain should be illegal, and nobody should do any work on the Sabbath day. Marriage required parental permission as well as an application to the state, and widows and widowers would not be allowed to remarry within a year of their spouse's death. Selling alcohol to Indians was still finable. Courts and appeals courts were also established, as well as public schools, and it was made a rule that all children must learn how to read and write by 12 years old. Finally, everyone who believed in Jesus Christ got freedom to worship however they want, or not to worship. Also, some place names got shuffled around. Upland, the Swedish name for the Swedish town, got changed to Chester, an English name. Also, the city of Philadelphia was named by William Penn himself, and it was decided that the city should occupy an area of 2 miles by 1 mile. The colony was in business. Remember that Calvert guy, Lord of Baltimore? Well, 1682 was a busy year. His son, the new Lord Baltimore, picks this year to pop up north and ask the Pennsylvanians about where his colony's northern border was. He had a piece of paper from 1632 signed by the king saying that the colony of Maryland extended to a part of the Delaware Bay laying under the 40th degree. He writes a letter to the people who seem to be in charge. He waits for a response, then gets fussy. He decides to personally make a trip north with 40 armed men and demand that someone negotiate with him where his border is. William Markham, the guy who was in charge until Penn's ship landed, got the job of talking to him. Markham essentially said, "Our governor isn't here yet, he'll be here soon, please take these nice-looking soldiers back down south and we'll let you know when he gets here." Baltimore essentially replied, "No." Markham said to him, "Look, dude, my boss is sailing over, he'll get here soon, and if I try to negotiate with you, he'll be mad at me, and he'll be coming to bug you some more because any deal I make with you now will be illegitimate. I don't want a gunfight over some stupid 40th parallel. Please take your soldiers down south, and William Penn will be around to deal with this when his ship lands." Baltimore still wasn't content. He asked Markham for a written and signed document stating that he refuses to cooperate in figuring out where the 40th parallel is. Markham provides the document, then Baltimore leaves in a huff eerily similar to that made by a 16-year-old being told they can't borrow the car this weekend. After Penn landed, he arranged a meeting with Baltimore. He traveled to Maryland in December. He showed Baltimore a brand new shiny piece of paper signed by the current king saying that, yes, the Delaware counties belong to Pennsylvania, the state does extend all the way to the Delaware Bay. Lord Baltimore replied, "But that's just a silly piece of paper. This is an official land grant. Besides, the king must not have known the geography of this place when he signed that. My grant says 40th parallel, which is north right about just above Philly, look at that. So, by rights, we should have Philadelphia." Penn replied, "That's ridiculous, and hey, doesn't your paper say below the 40th parallel, not up to the parallel? My land grant says I get the Delaware counties, so I get the bay, and you can still be below the 40th parallel." Needless to say, Penn left the meeting with no significant results, and each governor carried on with claims to large parts of the other's land. In fact, Baltimore even started charging taxes to people in the Delaware counties, and the Delaware counties got to send representatives to the Pennsylvania Assembly. One of the things Penn noticed after his arrival, in between dealing with Baltimore and looking after the Assembly, was that the colony had lots of healthy children. Almost every houseful, he writes, it is rare to find one without 3 or 4 boys and as many girls. Some 6 or 7 or 8 sons. Penn fit it into his schedule to also meet with the leaders of some local Indian tribes. The main purpose of most of his meetings with them this year was to buy land. He bought it fair and square. He didn't try to trick them like some tradesmen did, and he didn't take the land by force like some other colonial governments did. There's a famous painting that was commissioned decades later by one of his descendants showing his meeting with the Lenape tribe, but he also met with the Iroquois and the Susquehannocks. This fair treatment of the Indians would earn Penn a very good reputation among the local tribes. It would also earn some not-so-good attention from the New York colony up north. They were worried that all his deals with the natives would interfere with their trade with them. That, and they weren't so crazy about this whole Quakerism thing. Shouldn't those guys be following Church of England? The governor of Albany wrote back to the king in England and asked him to dispossess Penn of the colony. It was better back when New York controlled Pennsylvania. Of course, Maryland wasn't happy with Penn either, for border dispute reasons, as well as trade and religious reasons. In 1684, there was a witch trial. It was the only witch trial in Pennsylvania. 2 women were accused of doing witchy stuff to someone's cows. Their husbands each paid their bail, and they were set free. In 1695, Penn sailed back to England for 4 years and returned in 1699. Now, there's a rather persistent problem that started cropping up in the 1690s. You see, the thing about putting Quakers into a 17th century colony is this. They're pacifists. They don't fight. This greatly worried the non-Quaker half of the colony, considering they were a growing community bound to attract some kind of outside attention, and half of their population refused to touch a gun. They'd been controlled by 3 different nations in the past 40 years, after all. This colony thing was dangerous for more reasons than just natives. Christ Church in Philadelphia seemed to be the place where all the people who were worried about Quaker pacifism went to. Assembly members were chosen every October. Along with them, the county sent nominations for sheriffs and coroners that the assembly would vote to hire for 3-year terms. It decided that the estate of someone who committed suicide was to be passed down as if it were a natural death. And it was decided by the Quaker majority in the assembly that nobody should be allowed to compel someone to do anything that is against their religion. Such as, I don't know, serving in any kind of military, for example. Just an example. Penn left the state again a few years after his return and went back to live in England. From then on, anyone in the Penn family would be, well, pretty absent from the colony, only coming over every few years for vacation. Instead of properly serving their roles as governor, the governor position got passed down through the family, they would appoint lieutenant governors to live in PA and be the executive to the Assembly's legislative. The Assembly itself was out of session for most of the year, specifically in spring, summer, and fall. Why? Well, planting season. This was a farming colony. Everyone had a lot of land and a lot of crops to look after. Winter was the time when the Assembly members didn't have anything else to do. Most of the governors of the colony didn't do much exciting, but there's one in particular I will mention, John Evans, a Welshman who served from 1704 to 1709. This man was not a Quaker. He was also not pleased with the Quakers' pacifism, at all. He called for a militia multiple times, and was pretty much just ignored by the Assembly. He didn't stop there, though. At one point, he arranged for someone to ride through Philly on a horse yelling that the French were getting ready to attack the city, hoping to get some of the Quakers to pick up a gun. The result, the Quakers gathered in a church, and most of the other people ran into the woods to hide. Tough luck, Johnny. This same guy also had a fort built at Newcastle along the Delaware River, and tried to put a toll on the river. Pretty early in his term, one of the assembly members tried to get him expelled by seeing he was too young to serve as governor. Evans, in turn, sued the man for slander. The population was growing. Religious groups were growing with them. Philadelphia had a growing Jewish population, so that was something. Also, a Roman Catholic church was built. People questioned whether it should be allowed because, well, it wasn't Protestant. But they left it up. In 1720, it was estimated that the white population in Pennsylvania had surpassed the Native American population, and in 1723, the colony officially started printing paper money. Our friend William Penn wouldn't live to see that, though. He died in July of 1718. William Penn Jr., or the Third, or whatever the suffix is, got the governor's seat after his father died. He only got to keep it for 2 years, though, because he himself died in 1720. The attrition cost of intertribal wars in the Native American community and the power of 6 or 7 or 8 sons per household combined to give the result a lot of Europeans in the New World and fewer Native Americans than there were before. The whites moved west. Land was bought fairly most of the time. The problem with this was that sometimes they thought they were buying land fairly, but it turns out any old Indian could dress up and say that they were the leader of a local tribe. Yes, give me money and I'll let you keep this land. Then they would run away, and the local tribe would be left wondering who these people were that they never sold land to. Fun times in the New World. Despite the government not being as active in affairs as perhaps the colonists would have liked, the economy was in pretty good shape for what it was. The assembly didn't need to tax or levy any goods until the 1740s. Mortgage payments were enough for the government to sustain itself. The mid-1720s was when people started feeling the them and us aspect of the acting governor being a representative of the proprietor, so someone over in England with the last name Penn, and the proprietor himself being a representative of the king, thousands of miles away, as opposed to assembly members who were representatives of the people in whichever county they came from. Lancaster County was created in 1729. That county added some new members to the assembly. In 1732, a member of the Penn family named Thomas came here to live and govern for more than a few years. Cool. In 1736, members of the Iroquois Confederacy came to Philadelphia to formally announce that they were no longer the 5 nations, but the 6 nations of the Iroquois. Good for them. In 1737, Thomas Penn noticed the expanding population in the colony. Very conveniently, he found a document dated 1682 describing a deal with the Lenape that was worked out but never followed through on. The deal essentially said that the Lenape liked Penn so much that they would let him use an area of land between the Delaware and Lehigh rivers that extended as far as a man could walk in a day and a half. Penn approached the leaders of the Lenape with this piece of paper and asked them, "Hey, don't you think maybe we could still make this happen?" The Lenape responded, "Well, the guy who was chief 50 years ago said this was the deal, so I guess we have to follow through with it." They agreed to give the whites the amount of land that someone could leisurely walk across within a day and a half. Penn wanted as much land as he could get from this, so he found the 3 most experienced woodsmen in the colony. He pulled them aside and told them, "Whichever one of you can cover the most land tomorrow gets this big ol' bag of money courtesy of me and the assembly." Money sounds good, they all agreed, so they got ready to leisurely walk as fast as they could for the prize money. Now, did they walk it or run it? I'll read you some highlights of their day and let you decide. In the morning, not even noon yet, the first guy collapsed from exhaustion. The other 2 told him, "It's okay, sit down and rest on this log, you can go back to town when you're ready. We're just gonna keep going for that prize money. See ya." Next up, in late afternoon, the second guy fell into a creek and drowned. Now, given that he was one of the most experienced woodsmen in the colony, I'm gonna wager he didn't not know how to swim. Maybe he was just too exhausted to pull himself out? Possibilities. The third guy went on to plant his place marker in the ground in the middle of the day the next day, and won Penn's prize money. The Lenape, when they realized how much land was covered, brought up whether the woodsmen ran or walked. The colonists, of course, insisted that they walked. The Lenape decided to believe them and said, "Sure, you can take double the land we were planning to give you. Completely free. Just go ahead and take it." The whites said, "Okay, we will." I wonder why the natives didn't press this issue further. The world may never know. I am quite sure that this decision will never haunt the settlers any time in the future. Anyway, that whole deal was known as the walking purchase. Next up, Baltimore brings up the land dispute again. This time, the discussion lasted 2 years, from 1732 to 34. It ended with both colonies going to meet the king. Shortly after, in 1736, Baltimore started charging taxes to people living in the disputed counties. The people responded by writing a formal letter to Baltimore renouncing allegiance to Maryland. Baltimore then sent soldiers up there who didn't have much ability to do anything, so they went home. Baltimore then writes a letter to the county saying that if they pretty please pay this reduced tax, he will gladly welcome them back into Maryland, but if not, there will be more troops this time, I mean it. After the soldiers left, Pennsylvanians wanted to respond, but of course they didn't have an official militia. The word my source uses to describe it is a posse of 24 Pennsylvanians who went down to the county. Then, nothing happened. A group called the Lords of Trade, something which was meant to be a link between the colonies and the crown, ended up taking over the situation, and setting up temporary boundaries while they worked this thing out. Speaking of not having a militia, people were starting to get really worried because they had figured out there would probably be a war with Spain soon. The acting governor asked the assembly for a militia. The assembly said no. The governor said, "Pretty please?" The assembly said, "No. Not even if we allow religious exemptions?" Not even then. Darn. In 1740, that war with Spain came. The election of assembly members that year at least a little bit more reflected the desires of the people for some kind of defense. The assembly voted on a bill that would give the king money. That was it. It didn't explicitly state what the money was for, it simply said, "for the king's use," the logic being, render unto Caesar. The people in England would understand that this was defense money, and the Quakers could avoid the moral conundrum of voting for something that will explicitly, indirectly, lead to violence. The war, and the Quakers on the assembly, resulted on an especially contentious election in 1742, one which caused a riot in Philly. In 1742 also, some natives from the Iroquois 6 nations came to Philadelphia to beg, of all things, food. They reported that their tribe was starving, and they were having a hard time because of unfair land claims by the whites. The residents of the city insisted that the land claims were fair, but nevertheless gave the tribe all the food they needed. In 1744, war broke out with France. This war would last until 1748 and be known as King George's War in the colonies, but the War for Austrian Succession across the pond. A lot of native tribes, including the Lenape, who had been pushed west, liked the French style of occupation, which consisted of a lot of forts and a lot of trading, but no farming and no great mass of thousands of settlers. They hated the English by contrast, so they joined the French. Not the Iroquois, though. When the English sent a messenger to make sure the Iroquois wouldn't join the French, they replied that they would stay neutral until one of the two sides pulled them into the war by directly attacking them. Good to know. While the English were running around left and right to try and preserve whatever friendly relations they had with allied tribes, French-aligned tribes were wreaking havoc in all the frontier lands of Pennsylvania. And by frontier, I mean Berks and Lancaster area. This place was settled, but not that settled. In 1745, the Quaker-controlled assembly was finally convinced to sign a bill to give provisions to the King's army. Them being Quakers, though, they didn't put anything about weapons or ammunition in the bill, like anyone who wasn't familiar with Quakers would have expected them to. Just whatever food and clothing they needed. Luckily, the people reading the bill had a creative imagination and were able to take an interpretive view of it. They read the phrase, corn and other grains, and decided that other grains should be taken to mean gunpowder. So, cool. The Quakers bought us gunpowder. We can fight. And so the war with the French would go in Pennsylvania. Now, there were plenty of people who realized that, while the Quakers did keep the taxes low and local tribes friendly, their pacifism could be hazardous. The non-Quakers of the colony, especially those whose houses and farms and neighbors were getting attacked by Indians on the frontier, desperately wanted a militia, something the assembly would never in a million years give them. Luckily, some people in the colony were willing to take action. Benjamin Franklin was a clerk to the assembly around this time. He hadn't gotten the position for doing nothing. Since the 1720s, he had been in Philly doing basically everything and making his face known in the community. He had written for a newspaper and eventually worked his way up to owning a newspaper. He had started a free public library, as opposed to libraries that charged membership fees, and he had started the city's fire company. As far as Quaker pacifism in the assembly went, though, Franklin was no Quaker. He was born up in New England and came down to Philly in his teenage years. A common-sense school of thought, deeply established roots in the local system, and more community organizing experience than a collective school board. This guy was exactly what Pennsylvania needed, and I would love to make him a biography at some point. In 1747, he wrote a pamphlet called Plain Truth, in which he suggested if the assembly didn't see to the protection of the colony, the people should do it themselves. This prompted a huge town hall meeting in Philadelphia, which, of course, Franklin took a prominent part in. That day, they got 1,200 members signed up to join a privately run militia, and in coming weeks, they would get thousands more volunteers from the counties. By the end, they had 10,000 people they could call upon to fight. Next, he sent a few letters out. One was sent to the governor of New York asking to borrow some of their cannons, another to a Royal Navy admiral asking them to station a warship in Delaware Bay for extra protection. While waiting for replies, he went over to the Philadelphia Fire Department, of which, as I mentioned, he was a founding member, and asked them to do a little fundraising. They do, and they buy some fire prevention equipment, namely a fine cannon. Fire engine. That is a fire engine. I should have mentioned some of the firefighters were Quakers. York County was formed in 1749. Cumberland in 1750, Berks and Northampton in 1752. Effort was made by the English to ally themselves with the Native American tribes in the west, closer to the Ohio area and the French territory, and something called the Ohio Company was chartered with the goal of building an English fort and settling 100 English families in the Ohio area within 7 years of its creation. Westward expansion was happening, despite the war with the French. The natives warned settlers to stay in the east and stop expanding. The English response in this interwar period was to build more forts in the west in anticipation of another war with the French, fought both in and over the colonies. The French already had a considerable amount of forts. That war would come in 1754 by the American reckoning, 1756 by the European reckoning. Although a year earlier the government in London had told the governors of the colonies to cooperate with each other in repelling any French that should invade English land. Europe would call it the 7 Years' War, but Americans know this one as the French and Indian War. Although the war would be fought on the European mainland as well as other continents, Britain's main focus would be in North America. They worked on fielding an army in Pennsylvania at the beginning of the war that the Assembly as well as other state governments paid large sums of money towards. They made several pushes into French territory to the west, including Washington's battle at Fort Necessity, but very few of these would go well for the British. They would be pushed back at every turn, in the beginning at least. The French weren't the only ones they were fighting. Remember how the Native Americans tended to like the French more than the English because the French didn't terraform massive amounts of land into farms and boot local tribes westward? The Iroquois were the only major Native American ally to the British in this region during the war. As before, the Lenape and the Ohio tribes would be terrorizing Lancaster and other western PA counties. 1755 was still a year before the war began in Europe. It was also the year General Braddock arrived in the colony with an army of soldiers from Britain, ready to have another go at the French Fort Duquesne, now Pittsburgh, which others including Washington had failed to take the previous year. When Braddock's army came, the things they didn't happen to fit on the boats included wagons to transport supplies and horses to pull the wagons. He needs someone here to get him those, so the person he contacts is Ben Franklin, because the guy is basically the Walpole of Pennsylvania at this point. Ben puts out an ad through the newspaper offering to rent people's wagons, if anyone has any spares, and offering to pay drivers too, drivers not required to fight. You can trust that this general will be good on his word too, because Ben Franklin himself can vouch for him. And with that, the people came and volunteered their wagons and horses, and Braddock thanked Franklin for avoiding the soldiers having to raid farms and levy the wagons without paying the farmers. Good for us, I guess. Franklin would later write that the general seemed overconfident, boasting that the conquest of Fort Duquesne would take less than a week. Franklin warned him that in the Pennsylvania wilderness, the French tribes were especially adept at laying traps and surprise attacks. If he wasn't careful, they would be likely to attack his flanks in several places at once while he was traveling, and so cut his line in multiple places like a thread. Braddock's reply, as quoted by Franklin, was something like, "These savages may indeed be a formidable enemy to your raw American militia, but against the king's regulars, it is impossible they should make an impression. For some reason, we named a town after this guy." Next up, Braddock starts marching the army west, and eventually they get to a point where there's not enough road for the wagons. So he stops and hires a group of locals to clear a path to travel by, and he posts guards to make sure the workers don't get killed by French-aligned Native Americans. And so passes the better part of the summer as they make their way along the 120-mile path that the misinformed British initially believed to be 70 miles, with the divided British having skirmishes with the Indians the whole way. This all came to a front when they had a major shootout with French infantry about 10 miles from the fort. And yeah, they lost. Braddock got shot in the lung, the army was too split up to not be in chaos. Yeah, they were done. Braddock died, and George Washington and about 300 others, of the 2,200 that started, were the only ones to make it back. So that's how 1755 went. What, you thought real life would be climactic? Oh, and Franklin had to deal with all those farmers asking where their horses and supply carts went. After Braddock's defeat, the Ohio tribes kinda had a heyday in the undefended Pennsylvania frontier counties. People would find their neighbors lying dead in their front yards with their scalps cut off. Many families picked up and moved to safer parts of the colonies. The natives, encouraged, kept striking further east, even going as far as Reading. Some of the tribes vowed that they would take any fort that can catch fire, and they would only stop after the English teach them to make gunpowder. But wait, I hear you ask. America speaks English, not French. Didn't the English win this war? Well, yes, I'm getting to that. First off, not everyone left the frontier, and the ones who stayed knew better than to expect the Assembly to help them out with a formal militia. They formed their own groups for defense, but they did petition the Assembly asking for powder and ammunition, because hey, it's worth a try. They were lucky enough to get a receptive reply, but unfortunately all the guns and ammo that were available had to go to the army. A group of people in Lancaster even formed a long-term traveling mob that was planning to march to Philly themselves and demand that the Assembly take action and help them out. Little did they know help was actually coming. In the Assembly, even the Quakers were starting to see the need for action. Some of them, in the summer months, seeing the countryside get pillaged and knowing that their morals wouldn't do any good on the Assembly, resigned. 7 people resigned the Assembly that summer. Their absence of vote shifted the makeup of the body enough that in November, they were actually able to pass a militia bill. That, alongside a decision to start paying people who brought them Indian scalps, since the Indians already took so many white scalps. The law that if you harmed an Indian you'd face the same legal penalty as harming a white was still in effect, so hunters had to be careful to know which tribe was which. This might have been too little too late, but the gesture was appreciated. Needless to say, the Assembly was just hemorrhaging money from the war effort at this point. Speaking of the war effort, the Crown and proprietaries had not been idle. There's a new military commander in town, a guy named Dunbar. His job is to recruit a few thousand soldiers from the colonies for another trek out west against the French. They offered money to new recruits, and promised land in the Ohio Territory after it was conquered. They even lifted a rule against indentured servants joining the military, which led to many of their masters complaining because they paid for a boat ticket for these people to come over, the agreement made called for some amount of years working for the master in repayment, and now they're going off west to fight the French or something before the time was up. They weren't happy. Likewise unhappy were the people who were forced to quarter troops in their houses. But that was war in the British colony for you. After Dunbar's army left, there was another army brought up, made from troops recruited in the southern colonies. And then more troops landed from Britain. It would take a few years for them to make significant progress, but by 1758, Fort Duquesne would be burned, and by 1759, the French would be officially out of the region. The Native American attacks would continue throughout this time, and a group of 100 Highlanders was stationed in Reading to help defend against them. The Assembly had been spending quite a bit of money on the war, and so they needed to raise taxes to keep up with the spending. The people, of course, felt like they were giving something for nothing because with all the Assembly was doing, it still couldn't guarantee the safety of the people on the frontier. In 1758, Ben Franklin was already writing about how bad taxes were. Around this time, there was a meeting arranged between the Six Nations of the Iroquois and the Lenape Delaware tribe to exchange prisoners and get some Pennsylvanians released from Lenape captivity. A group of Quakers go to this meeting as well. The release of many people was indeed worked out. There was also another meeting, this one between just the Six Nations and the Quakers. The first order of business discussed was an Iroquois that was killed by a Pennsylvanian. They wanted justice. This was no problem because the penalty for murder in Pennsylvania was death, even if it was an Indian from a friendly tribe who was murdered. Next up, the Iroquois weren't blind to the English land grabbing, even though they were helping them against the French. They wanted a guarantee that the Iroquois would have a permanent reserved area of land that would never be encroached on by the English. The Assembly agreed. They also wanted to examine all of the land purchases Pennsylvania had ever done to make sure that none of them were invalid or were done with someone who was only pretending to be an Indian leader. After some discussion, the Assembly agreed to let the Iroquois examine the documents. The final thing they wanted from the Assembly was missionaries, Christian teachers. Many of their tribe had seen people's lives improved by Christianity, and they wanted to be formally educated on the religion. The Assembly hastily agreed to this one. The French were once and for all booted out of the region in 1760, although the war would continue for longer elsewhere. After they were pushed out, the native tribes were willing to talk about peace. One of the conditions of this peace was that the English were not allowed to live or even hunt on the other side of the border to Indian land. It would do for now. The last of the Indian prisoners were also released. Following the end of the war, new immigrants started coming again. The immigrants tended to move out west to the frontier, while the people who had lived through the war tended to stay east. The frontier, in turn, expanded due to the new life it was given. In addition to settlers, German preachers also wanted to live and teach the western tribes about Christianity. The two dominant political factions in Pennsylvania at this point were the Quakers, of course, and also the growing number of Church of England people. Because the western counties didn't have nearly as many representatives in the Assembly, and because there were people living in the land to the west of the counties that hadn't been organized into counties yet, there grew to be a stereotype that most of the Assembly members were posh Philly aristocrats who didn't have a clue what farming life was like. Some would say that the divide between East and West just needed a spark before something serious happened. That spark appeared to be Pontiac's rebellion in 1763. That year, a huge confederacy of Native Americans living in the formerly French regions, under command of Chief Pontiac, decided to kick the Brits out of the wilderness before they turned it all into farmland. In May, they got to work. Around the same time, they started to lay siege to British forts from Canada all the way down to Mississippi. A lot of those they successfully took, but one of the ones they couldn't take was Fort Pitt, on the site of the former Fort Duquesne. In addition to attacking forts, they also got to work against civilian settlements, including Christianized Indians in West PA, and yes, once again, the western counties of Pennsylvania. Now, this was, the third war with these same Indians in the past 20 years? People were getting pretty sick of it at this point, and especially sick of them targeting people who were just trying to live their lives in peace. The general in charge of Fort Pitt had a pretty drastic response. He decided to give smallpox blankets to the Lenape and Shawnee Indians who were attacking him, starting an epidemic. Makes you love the Geneva Convention, doesn't it? The settlers in the Lancaster area had a similarly drastic response. A group of 57 people got drunk one evening and decided, you know that Susquehannock village nearby? Yeah, I know they haven't attacked us yet, but come on, they're Indians. We should get them before they get us. So they did. They went over to a peaceful village and just started massacring men, women, and children. The Assembly condemned these guys, who would become known as the Paxton Boys, and tried to prosecute them. In response, a group of 600 people from Lancaster did what they do and started marching to Philly, planning to get the Assembly to listen to them, by force. They were met outside Philadelphia by who else? Who do you think? It was Franklin. Franklin successfully convinces these people to tone it down by about 20 notches, and the Assembly would host an orderly town hall meeting where their grievances would be heard. They were heard, but not much was done about it. Luckily, the war in Pennsylvania ended pretty quick. The British got an army together by spring and marched it up to Ohio, forcing the Lenape and Shawnees to surrender, dealing the first major dent to Pontiac's Confederacy. The war would go on for 2 more years after this, but it would stay out of PA for the most part. It was around this time the British Parliament noticed the colonies' collective war-to-peacetime ratio was way off. And I mean, someone's got to pay for all the soldiers they're sending over. So if you guys don't mind, we're just gonna Sugar Act and Stamp Act. It turns out they did mind it. Ben Franklin and others would waste no time in publicly denying the acts violated their rights as Englishmen to not have property taken without their consent. The Assembly took action and declared the acts unconstitutional in 1765, by reason of the colonies did not elect anyone to Parliament, therefore Parliament did not have a right to tax the colonies directly. People marched in the streets of Philly burning effigies of taxmen, and a group of Philadelphia merchants agreed to boycott any products from England that were affected by the tax, in some cases sending trade ships all the way back, still full of the cargo they were supposed to sell. In our next episode, we have settlers starting to encroach west into Ohio Indian land. The British in England, scared of another war, tell them to come back and send a group of troops up there to enforce the ruling. The settlers simply wait a couple months until the British forgot about the rule, and then go back west. In 1766, Ben Franklin, on a visit to England, tells Parliament that Americans will not tolerate the Stamp Act unless physically forced to by an army. Parliament, getting the message, later repeals the act, still wondering what they can do to get the money they need. In 1767, thinking it was the Stamp Act they didn't like and not fully grasping the concept of no taxation without representation, Parliament implemented new taxes on the colonies to replace the Stamp Act. These were the Townshend Acts. In 1767, the surveyors Mason and Dixon marked the borderline between Pennsylvania and Maryland, officially ending the border dispute. The new taxes prompted the famous Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer by John Dickinson. It also prompted a petition against the taxes from the people of Pennsylvania to the king himself. By this time, Parliament had already prohibited the manufacture of certain products in the colonies, and mandated that they could only be bought from the mother country, forcing the colonies to break boycotts. In 1768 and 69, the Assembly voted money to the American Philosophical Society for the purchase of a telescope, the goal being to observe the transit of Venus, something which was done by a guy named David Rittenhouse. In 1769, merchants of Philadelphia once again adopted a non-importation agreement and started sending boats packed full of British goods back to Britain. Parliament soon after repealed all taxes on the colonies except a tax on tea, which people really liked up in Boston. In fact, they threw a party to celebrate it in 1773. Actually, the party was to protest it, and the entertainment was a bunch of people dressing up as Indians and going onto merchant ships in the middle of the night and dumping millions of dollars worth of tea into the harbor. The Brits responded with what is known as the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston Harbor and put Massachusetts colony under military governorship until they paid the East India Company back for the tea. In response, all 13 colonies sent representatives to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The Congress sent a list of grievances to the king and Parliament. This succeeded in doing nothing but angering them, and the English government declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion. The Battle of Lexington and Concord happened in April 1755. The Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia in July 1776 by the Second Continental Congress. But months before that happened, another group was working on something just for Pennsylvania. By the end of 1776, most people had in fact accepted that a rebellion was occurring. Most people thought it was foolish, however, to rebel without first establishing a plan for government after the rebellion, which was what they were currently doing. Each state was considered to be responsible for their own government. After all, why overthrow British rule if they were just going to put all the colonies under one government again? To understand Pennsylvania politics at this time, as well as at almost any time in history, it's important to look at the contrast between urban and rural. Philly and Pitt, even today, have a completely different world of political ideas than the rest of the state. And the split of the population on such a geographical basis has caused us to be a swing state in most elections since our beginning. On the frontier, people didn't pay as much attention to the people in Boston yelling about taxes as they did to their neighbors yelling about defense of the citizens. From the 1740s all the way to the previous decade, they had, from their point of view, needed to take defense into their own hands with little help from the Assembly and occasional help from the king. That was a high priority on their list of desirous outcomes that could result from the revolution, and the most likely way to get it was to overturn the Assembly and proprietorship. That wasn't their only goal, though, which is why they didn't hop on the bandwagon for a short-lived effort by Easterners to disinherit the Penn family and give direct control to the king a decade earlier. The thing they were scared of the king doing? Forcing England's religion on them. That was the whole reason them and their parents had left Europe. They didn't want someone else forcing a religion on them. They wanted freedom to practice whatever they wanted. If they were going to be on board for this rebellion, they would need some promise of overturning the Penns and the current system of Pennsylvania government, as well as the king's power in the New World. They wanted a constitution that they could shape to give them more control over their own lives. Not some airheads over in Philly that didn't even wait to start the assembly if one of the frontier representatives was late due to bad weather. In Philly, the Bostonians' cry of no taxation without representation had resonated a bit more. Their lack of worry about physical danger from the Pontiac tribes had limited their sense of gratitude towards the Redcoats. In addition, the taxes and boycotts had disturbed trade at the port enough that the economic effects could be felt all across the colony. These people had no love for the king. As far as Penn goes, they mistrusted that family because all their time spent in England, and the perceived influence that English politics had on their decisions. If there was to be a rebellion, Pennsylvania would need a government that didn't answer to the Penns. Finally, the Assembly and the way representatives were elected. Well, a large demographic of Philadelphians didn't like that either, for one simple reason. Can you guess it? Voting. Specifically, who was allowed to vote. Only white men, I hear someone say, but not even all white men. You see, 90 years ago when the colony was chartered by Penn, one of the requirements for a person to vote was that they had to own land. This rule was fine when the colony's population was only a 3 or 4 digit number, but now, our population was in the tens of thousands, and Philly was one of the biggest cities in the 13 colonies. Every person in that city who did not own their own land could not vote. People say that the miracle of the American Revolution is that the British lost. I think an even bigger miracle is that Lancaster and Philly actually agreed on something as central to their well-being as overthrowing the government, and then managed to successfully work together towards their goal. The working together came in the form of a constitutional convention that lasted throughout the summer of 1776. They were basically racing against the Second Continental Congress, which on July 4th would officially declare the 13 colonies independent from the king, to produce their respective influential documents. Ben Franklin at this time was on the Continental Congress, rather than the Constitutional Convention. There was a lot of work being done. The Assembly? Well, they tried to meet that year, but seeing as the convention was both making a new government and taking over some of the government functions the Assembly already, it didn't matter how many people called it illegitimate because its members had simply dubbed themselves in control. The Assembly didn't have a quorum. The people who sent representatives to the Assembly trusted the convention more, and didn't even bother sending people to the Assembly this year. The convention lost its race with Congress to come out with an influential document, but still ended up being one of the first few states with its own working government. A summary of the Constitution: there would be one House of Congress. Instead of a single executive position, usually given the title of President or Governor, there would be an entire executive committee elected. On their first meeting of every election cycle, they would choose amongst themselves someone to be president of that committee. Every 7 years as well, there would be a meeting of chosen representatives to decide whether the Constitution needed any amending. If it did, they would have the authority to write and vote on amendments. The voting issue was fixed. It was now any free man over the age of 21, no land requirement. The frontiersmen were happy because the distribution of power weighted more heavily on geography than it had before, as opposed to population. In addition, the landed Quaker elite in Philly had suffered a serious blow to their ability to dominate any kind of statewide government, because a mass of non-land-owning people now had a vote equal to theirs. Those who were represented in theory now had something to back it up. And the Quakers? Well, they got something out of the mix too. They got a special provision in the Declaration of Rights in this Constitution, saying that no one should be forced to join any kind of military or do any kind of fighting if their religion prohibited them from doing so. People pushed back against this Constitution as hard as people today are pushing back against Trump. But in the end, this was Pennsylvania's best and only option. And it wasn't a bad one. It would stick, at least through the war. The first election was held over the winter of 1776 and 77, and by February, everyone was ready to be inaugurated. The elected officials marched through the streets of Philly to the sounds of cannons that George Washington had stolen from the Hessians at Trenton, in front of a cheering crowd. The war would later be won, and the Constitution would, after 14 years, get replaced. But that's a story for another time.